We're going to focus our energy today on just how to have difficult conversations as a community. We shared this graph about the difference between being simplistic and being simple. Simplistic is when you use simplicity before entering the complexity, and simple is when you use simplicity on the other side of the complexity curve. Time and time again throughout our history as a community, we've done this. We've gone through this process. We've had really complex questions we've had to answer as a community. And it's tempting when we have these critical questions and difficult questions to be simplistic and say, well, of course we should do this, or of course we shouldn't do this. But we've chosen as a community to enter the complexity time and time again. And it's taken time, years sometimes, but we've come out of that complexity. But here we are. We entered the complexity as a community, and what do we do about it, right? So I want to spend a little bit of time going into some frameworks and some models that have been helpful as I wrestle with complex questions in other contexts, and hopefully it'll be relevant here as well. It's a conversation with a lot of very strong opinions. And what happens when you look at this these stories of doing things and hurting people is, let's say person A does something or doesn't do something or says something, and then person B feels hurt. And then person B, maybe they don't do it intentionally, but then they say something or do something, and then person A feels hurt. And if you ask these people, well, who's to blame? Who's at fault for this pain? You'll get different answers depending on who you ask, and it's possible that person B will say, well, no, it's person A's fault because person A did this or said this or didn't do this, right? But if you ask person A, you'll say, no, it's person B's fault because he or she did or didn't do or said or this. Or they might even go back into the past and pull something from the past and say, actually, person B did something years ago, or person B always does this, right? Or always talks this way, and that's painful and that's hurt. And so whether we're talking about Israel and Palestine or Russia and Ukraine, part of the problem is who is to blame depends a lot on where you start telling the story in that timeline. And one of the things we have to learn is that maybe who's to blame is the wrong question. In fact, the question is probably what is to blame. And if we see the pattern, we realize that what is to blame is the fact that we're looking at this in a linear fashion. We're looking at this from a timeline perspective instead of looking at as the dynamic that it is, which is a vicious cycle that we loop into where we constantly are hurting each other back and forth. And that really is the culprit. And when we were able to sort of rise above the conflict and see it from above and see these vicious cycles, that's when we can begin to see we have to do something different. So the question really for us is, how do we break these cycles? And there are a lot of different models and frameworks out there that approach this. I'm going to just share two that I have found super helpful. And one of them, it's called the ladder of inference. And it's this concept that actions don't happen in a vacuum. Actions are the result of analyzing and deciding what action to take. And you conclude which action to take based on your conclusions by interpreting sort of what the data you have. And of course, you interpret the data you have by getting data and hearing stories in the first place. But those data and stories come from all the experiences and all the stories in the world, and you don't have the bandwidth or the brain width to hear all the stories. So you pick a few stories, and you pick the stories that resonate with you, and you're selective about the stories you hear. And so the problem with this is that it's a reinforcing feedback loop. It's also a vicious cycle, because once I've reached a conclusion, then I continue looking for stories that continue to confirm what I already believe. So if I already believe that Trump is the worst person in the world, then I'm going to continue looking for more stories that prove that point. And I will get deeper and deeper in this perception. But I'm not alone. Person B lives in the same world as I do, but person B has a completely different perception and is hearing different stories, and they're hearing all about how Biden is the worst person in the world. And so the actions we take really derive from the stories we choose to listen to. And that is part of the problem we have to confront as a community, is what stories are we choosing to listen to? Now, part of the problem has to do with the fact that when I go through this process of hearing stories and then interpreting the stories and then reaching my conclusions, I become convinced that I have really important information. And then I want the world to know that information. And so I get into advocacy mode and I say, hey guys, this is the truth. And if you only knew what I knew, then we would all agree, right? If you only had the data and heard the stories that I've heard, then we would be on the same page. And of course, person A is also going through the same process and is also entering advocacy mode. And so we have these conversations happening at the top of the ladder where we're shouting a lot but not listening very much. And if I don't really care about the other person, it's not the end of the world, because I can just distance myself from them and just surround myself by people who do think like I do. Now, if I have to live with them, then I enter this political battle, the power struggle. Maybe if I have the power for 4 years, I can impose my policies and my advocacy. But then usually it's a pendulum that goes back and forth with power struggles. But if I do care about person B, it's hard. What we tend to do and what we have done as a community is avoid the topic. I care about you, and I know you see it differently, so let's not talk about it, because that way we don't fight. Or if we do talk about it, we enter this cycle of saying things that the other person interprets incorrectly, and we enter this cycle of hurt. So how do we solve this problem? Part of it has to do with moving from advocacy to inquiry. And it's climbing down the ladder back to the data and the stories that we're listening to. And it's realizing that our job isn't to persuade the other people, but to learn from them. And so when we go down the ladder, back to the stories, to the raw data, and we start listening, and we proactively listen to the other side, we can start engaging in these difficult conversations in a healthier way. But the problem is this is really hard to do. And it's really hard to do because there are parts of my story that I know about myself and that you know about me. And there we can have an open conversation. But there are parts of the story that I know that you don't know. And I don't want to tell you, because I'm scared. I'm afraid that you're going to judge me, or that you're not going to see me the same way you saw me before, or that, worse, you're going to use that against me someday. So having enough trust to have somebody move from hidden to known is really risky. If I really say what I think, how will you respond? Will it come back to bite me? But then, of course, there's things that you can see about me that I don't know about myself. Maybe my journey, I'm just starting, and maybe you've already been down this path before, and you know where that story's going to end. And you can see the patterns. You can say, oh, my goodness, that's just a terrible decision that you're making. But if I am not willing to accept that I have blind spots, then I'm never going to learn those things about myself. And of course, there's things that neither of us know. So part of what we have to do as a community to broach these difficult subjects is to create a safe space. A space where I can listen, before we do that, where I can listen to you, and in listening to you, I can learn more about myself. But we also have to have a safe space to be able to tell parts of our story that we haven't shared before and know it's not going to come back to bite us and know it's not going to hurt us. And that can only happen when we listen without judgment. And if we enter this space, then hopefully both of us will learn things that we both don't know about ourselves. So we want to create this open conversation, but that will require several things. It'll require that we move from persuasion to curiosity, right? To say, I really want to know your story. I really do. Not to try and convince you, but to learn, right? It'll require empathy, not just having information that you have. I'm not interested in just the information, the data, or the statistics, or whatever that you have that I don't have. I'm interested in the feelings you have. I want to know why you feel what you feel. And of course, both of these require trust. They require this notion that maybe we're never going to agree. Maybe we're going to, go to our tomb solidly convinced that we were right. But we still love each other. So doing this requires having this genuine question of, really, I want to know more about why you feel how you feel. To wrap up this theory piece, I think maybe the meta-narrative is we need to be a community that learns from its mistakes, that learns from each other, that learns from its past. It's very, very tempting to be a community that avoids the things that divide us. But we can't be that. We can't ignore that we have the differences. But we also can't go to the extreme and move into the advocacy mode and just face these differences with persuasion instead of curiosity. I invite you guys all today to be a community that genuinely focuses on learning and builds our future and our decisions about this very difficult topic together.